Greetings, class. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 28, Section 4, which covers the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany during the interwar years, the 1920s and 30s. Both Italy and Germany turned to fascist systems of government after World War I because of political and economic crises that took place in their countries. The 1920s and 1930s were an era or an age of anxiety throughout all of Europe and really the entire globe. Many Europeans had become frustrated with their existing forms of government and no longer believed that these traditional political institutions could solve the complicated modern problems of the post-war world. Citizens either saw democratic bureaucracies bogged down in partisan debates where nothing got done, or they watched weak monarchs make foolish mistakes that ruined the effectiveness of their country. Really, many Europeans began to see their old governments as being inefficient and not effective. Another reason many Europeans distrusted their old governments was because they had failed to negotiate favorable terms at the Paris Peace Conference, and they did not receive any major prizes from the eventual Treaty of Versailles. But the greatest source of frustration and fear that most Europeans had was the Great Depression, and how this massive economic global failure was not being dealt with appropriately by their leaders. The Great Depression caused economic stagnation, which means like the loss of jobs and the loss of like productivity. It also led to increased unemployment, so people didn't have jobs, and also caused hyperinflation of currency. That means when you have hyperinflation that the value of your currency essentially disappears. And so something that might have cost like $1 one day now costs only has the value of like 10 cents. An example of this sort of weakened currency caused by hyperinflation can be seen in the photos below, which were taken in Germany in the early 1920s. Because of their terrible inflation, by 1923, German currency wasn't even worth the paper that it was printed on. The worthless German mark, which is the name of their currency in the 1920s, could be found littered on the streets because it was basically worthless. And it'd be cheaper for you to build a kite out of the money, out of the German mark, than it would have been to go buy paper and make a kite out of paper. Often people would use the currency as wallpaper because that was also cheaper than actually buying wallpaper. Can you imagine making a kite out of dollar bills? Geez. As a result of these political and economic issues, the people of Italy and Germany became desperate and gradually began to support a new type of government called fascism. Named after the Latin term fasces, which refers to a bundle of rods bound tightly around an axe, which symbolizes authority of government, as shown by the picture to the left there. Fascism is a type of government that relies on a single leader who has total and complete power over the government and the people living under its influence. This kind of government is known as a totalitarian dictatorship. Fascists, or the name of the people who practice fascism, that's what fascists are ultra-nationalistic and militaristic, meaning they believe their country is vastly superior than all other nations, and they supported creating strong, large militaries and navies that could then be used to promote their nation's influence across the globe. Fascist leaders limit the freedom of their citizens by using government censors and secret police to silence and eliminate political rivals. Fascism was appealing to many Italians and Germans, which would be the two countries that embraced fascism during this time, because it promised to use the system to resurrect the lost national traditions of those countries and to bring back the prestige and power that they once had before World War I. And that they would do all this while preserving the existing social classes and make sure that individuals maintain their private property. This made this form of government very appealing to upper and middle classes. Finally, fascists despised socialism and democracy. And one reason why fascism became so popular in places like Germany and Italy is because it initially claimed that if you practice this government, it would prevent the spread of communism, which many people feared. Now, the first fascist government that emerged was from Italy, and it was led by this guy, Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was a former journalist and a former World War I veteran, and he created and promoted fascism as a way to stabilize the Italian economy, and that it would end socialist or communist influences in his country and it is also a method that could be used to return Italy back to the military glory that it once had when it was the Roman Empire centuries earlier. Mussolini's followers created a private army that were called the Black Shirts. They were named after the color of their uniforms. These folks were essentially police that Mussolini could tell what to do. He used the Black Shirts to break up strikes, to intimidate voters so they would vote along fascist ideas and party lines. And he would violently drive socialists who were elected into office out of office by having his Black Shirts beat them in public. Gradually, Mussolini and his fascist Black Shirts gained power and influence throughout Italy and became increasingly popular. In October of 1922, Mussolini and all of his followers met in Rome, which was the capital of Italy. And when they met, they gathered in the streets and they claimed that they were there to prevent a possible communist uprising. This caused intense conflict throughout Italy and led many congressmen and cabinet members to resign from office because they were worried about what this group was going to do and that nobody was trying to stop them. Eventually, through intimidation and violence, and also with threats, this giant gang of Black Shirts led by Mussolini are going to force the king of Italy to appoint Mussolini as his prime minister, and that he would then be appointed as the new head of government. While serving as this prime minister, Mussolini is going to dismantle the Italian constitution and transform the government from a constitutional monarchy where there was a Congress and a king that worked together to instead a dictatorship where he and his followers held all of the power and nobody could stop them. Rival political parties were disbanded. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press and trial by jury were all suspended as well, so you couldn't have any of those. And militarized police forces patrolled the Italian streets looking for anyone that spoke out against Mussolini and his followers. Eventually, a corporatist state was created in Italy. This is where political representation is determined by the economic sector that you work in, as opposed to the region that you live in. Some of the major corporate sectors that made up this new Italian government were farming, banking, manufacturing, so stuff you make in factories, and transportation. Within each corporate sector, representatives met to determine wages, the prices of goods, and also the working conditions that workers would experience. All business owners and laborers were expected to submit to the will of the state, no exceptions. Now, the other major fascist government that emerged was from Germany. After World War I, Germany went through many changes. The Kaiser, the former ruler of Germany, was forced to abdicate the throne as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, and he gave up his power, which led to the creation of a new republic. The Constitution, or the written set of rules for this new government, were created in the city of Weimar, which gave this new government its name, the Weimar Republic. Looks like Weimar. From the very beginning, this government was unpopular because it had signed and agreed to the humiliating conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. And many Germans viewed this act by this brand new government as an act of treason, and they saw their political leaders as traitors as a result. The Weimar Republic also struggled to deal with the numerous and devastating economic issues that were caused by the Great Depression, such as unemployment and hyperinflation, which we talked about earlier. Both right-wing and communist groups tried to, at different times, overthrow this brand new republic. The most famous of these mini uprisings was called the Beer Hall Push because it took place in a beer hall, and it happened in 1923. Although this uprising failed and was eventually put down by the government, it highlighted many of the weaknesses of this new German government in the Weimar Republic and the growing frustrations the German people had about its inability to solve the country's problems. One of the leaders of this beer hall push was Adolf Hitler, who would use this event to increase his popularity and gain support for his political party, the Nazis. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, was one of many new political groups that emerged in Germany after World War I. The party was ultra-nationalist, anti-Semitic, which is when somebody or a group of people practices open hostility and prejudice against people who are Jewish. It was anti-communist. The Nazi Party promised initially to protect Germany from communist influences by attacking and targeting communist groups. One of the first Nazi recruits was Adolf Hitler, who, while he was serving time in jail for his role in the beer hall push, wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which means my struggle in German. The book outlined many of the beliefs and goals of the Nazi movement, and in particular discussed Hitler's belief that Germany could achieve racial purity through the total elimination of all Jews and other groups that he personally considered impure. Over time, these anti-Semitic beliefs and this ideology of Hitler and the Nazi Party would transform into active discrimination against Jews and other ethnic minorities in the country, and their freedoms and their safety would be severely limited. Hitler was known for being a powerful and charismatic speaker. After finishing his prison sentence, he used his oratory abilities to attract many listeners and gain greater support for his Nazi Party. In his speeches, he appealed to the frustrations of many Germans by promising that if his party was elected to power, that they would repeal the different terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and that they would ultimately restore Germany to its former glory and save the economy. And he often placed blame for all the problems that Germany faced on the different German ethnic minority groups, such as the Jews that lived in the country. He used them as a scapegoat to blame for all the country's problems. Throughout the 1920s and into the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party continued to grow in power and influence. Because of the problems caused by the Great Depression, the Nazis were able to gain increased support and followers, and used this support to get over 230 different Nazi people elected into power in the early 1930s. Eventually, enough Nazis were elected into political power that they were able to control their Congress and were able to pass laws without anybody being able to stop them. They used this increased power to appoint Hitler as the Prime Chancellor of Germany, which is essentially like the Prime Minister. And he used his new position to expand his powers and to weaken his rivals. Eventually, him and the other Nazis that were elected into office would transform Hitler's position from Prime Chancellor to dictator for life. And they would begin to dismantle the German government. Hitler and his Nazi followers used democracy to achieve power. And then once they had it, they then used their power to dismantle democracy so that they can never be kicked out of power and they would never lose that power. Once he was in power, Hitler and the Nazis Hitler appointed himself as Der Führer. This means the leader in German. He turned Germany into what is called a police state. He banned labor unions. He silenced opposition newspapers that criticized him and other Nazis. And he made it illegal to be a member of different political parties. To enforce all of his policies, he created a secret police force called the Gestapo, which was similar to Mussolini's black shirts, where they patrolled the streets looking for dissenters. He then began persecuting different groups of people that he and other Nazis considered inferior, such as the Jews. Many Jews were forced to wear the Star of David so they could be identified by the government and other people in public. And different laws were passed that restricted a lot of the rights and freedoms of people who were Jewish or were part of these other minority groups that were targeted by the Nazis. Anybody who spoke out against Der Führer, so Hitler, and his new government would be sent to concentration camps. Initially, these camps were prison camps where you would hold dissenters and people that spoke out against the government. But over time, they'd be transformed into systematic extermination camps where these dissenters would be killed. Hitler called this German Empire the Third Reich. Reich is the German word for empire. Hitler claimed that the first German Empire, the First Reich, was the Holy Roman Empire, and that the Second Reich had been the Prussian Hohenzollern dynasty. Prussia was once a major, powerful German state. His Third Reich, his current government, he claimed would last for over 1,000 years. Early in the 1930s, Hitler and the German Third Reich began to openly violate the Treaty of Versailles. Germany began to rebuild its military, which was a direct violation of the treaty. They moved troops into demilitarized zones, such as the Rhineland, and he also created a military alliance with Mussolini in Italy, which was called the Rome-Berlin Axis. That was the name of their alliance. All of these actions violated the Treaty of Versailles, but France and Britain refused to react because they believed that these violations were not worth going to war over, and that if they gave in to these demands, it would prevent a bigger conflict. As a result, Hitler would be emboldened to perform even more aggressive actions throughout the rest of the 1930s as he continued to increase his power and influence in the years leading up to World War II.